Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the community conversation on racial equity. I am Mayor Laura Weinberg, and it is wonderful to be together with all of you tonight. Although we can't see you all, I can see the participants, and I know we will be able to have interaction this evening. I am thrilled by the turnout and the interest in this conversation, and thank you all for being here. I am sure we are going to have a really good evening. I'm hearing some feedback. I'm not sure if I'm coming through okay, but hopefully I'm coming through clearly. In order to increase our understanding of our community, we need to be able to talk to each other and to listen to each other. And tonight is an opportunity to begin that sharing and really lay the groundwork of who we are as a Golden community and what changes we would like to see for our future. I am so pleased to have an expert in this area here with us tonight to facilitate the meeting. We have Dr. Nita Mosby Tyler, and she is the Chief Catalyst and founder of the Equity Project. The Equity Project is the culmination of over 30 years of experience and is designed to support organizations and communities in building diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Dr. Tyler holds a doctorate in organizational leadership, a master's in management, and a Bachelor of Science in Education. She specializes in the development and delivery of leadership, equity, diversity, cultural responsiveness, and inclusiveness training programs and strategies. We are very fortunate to have her here this evening for our conversation in Golden. So again, I want to thank you all for your interest and for being here and for your active participation this evening. I am going to turn things over to Nita. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. And thanks to all of you for joining. I really do appreciate it. You know, we love technology, and there's a little bit of a hiccup with technology tonight. I'm not able to share my screen with you, but it's not a showstopper because I know exactly what I want to say. Beyond thank you, I want to give kudos to each of you for taking this time tonight to carve out a space for community to have what I think is one of the toughest conversations to have, and that is, what do we do with this thing we're calling racial equity? How do we advance it? How is that different than what we've been talking about for decades, depending on how old you are? And what will it take for us to work in a collective to achieve it and to co-create all of the things that go into making your great community, the city of Golden, an even better community? So the thought is, why are we here tonight? Well, it's an interesting way to be in community, to carve out space for listening. I don't know about you, but one of the things that I see a lot today is our inability to listen. And so tonight's space is designed by the mayor and city council and others to create a space for city leaders to hear the voices of community. My job is to give you some prompts, some things that I want you to center some of your thinking and sharing around. And from that point forward, we're simply going to ask you to share in a way that's comfortable for you. Before we get started, there are just a few things that I want to lay out for us that would be really important. And the first one is an acknowledgement that I'd like to make. That acknowledgement is, I want to acknowledge what it feels like in a moment like this in history for all of us. Each of us is very different. We all have different lived experiences. We all get this thing called racial equity in different ways. But the reality is, this moment impacts us all. And I want you to think about it in a couple of different ways as we proceed tonight. I want you to think about the convergence of what I call several different pandemics. We've got the COVID-19 pandemic meets the racial injustice pandemic, meets these economic woes that we're experiencing, pandemic. These things coming together, converging, really have been hard for all of us. I want you to sit with that for a minute. The reason I want you to sit with that for a minute is it is not respectful to just pretend like nothing has happened. So I want you to know that it is important. It is very important that you take a minute to pause and to think about how the convergence of these pandemics has landed on you. I want you to think about how you've shifted under the convergence of these pandemics, how you've shifted, how you've changed. Who are you as a leader, as a parent, as a partner? Who are you now that you weren't even 18 months ago? And what that is important. It's important to acknowledge that your neighbors, whoever they are just as impacted as you are. And it's important to know that while we're in such an impacted time, our ability to have grace with each other will become more important. The thing that we are up against is bigger than any one of us. It is systems that weren't designed for everyone. So when you hear terms like racial equity, I want you to think about it as construction work. There are no U.S. systems that were built with equity in mind. Not healthcare, not the justice system, not education, housing, transportation, environmental and sustainability systems. They just simply weren't built with equity in mind. And so the responsibility that we have in our communities is to begin to think about how we turn our attention to the systems that we're actually trying to influence. Tonight is a great example of how you start that work. Couple of other things. I want you to know that talking about racial equity isn't new news. I know you know that. We've been talking about all kinds of things over the decades. I just want to remind you that just because we're talking about racial equity doesn't mean the other conversations end. For example, some of you may be old enough to remember when we started talking about diversity. That was in the 80s. In the 70s, equality. In the 90s, inclusivity. And here we are talking about racial equity. There is a relationship between each and every one of those words and those movements. I want you to know that just because we're talking about racial equity does not let us off the hook on work that we still need to do in those other words, diversity, inclusion, and equality. We've got plenty to do there. Equity and racial equity is about people having a lived experience that doesn't have things around race that hold them back and having a rich experience. It's defined as just and fair inclusion into a society in which all people, immaterial of their race or ethnicity, can participate, they can prosper, and they can reach their full potential. It's really about creating systems where everyone can thrive. People don't necessarily get the same things, but they get exactly what they need. I know a lot of you've probably seen that image with the people standing on boxes looking over a fence. I've seen that one a million times too. And the thing that sticks out to me about that is the fence itself. I don't know that people need a lot of fixing as much as systems do. And so the fence is what we need to talk about. The fence is the inequity. The fences are the inequities that are in our communities. And if you think about fences, the barriers to people getting what they need to thrive, that ought to be the business that we would want to be in. So the first question to get us going tonight is, when you think about the city of Golden, the communities that you live in, what are the fences that we need to be working on today? These are the barriers in the system. The conversation will be, what do you think those fences are? I want to start with us just beginning to identify what we think some of those barriers or inequities are that get in the way of us thriving in the community. So Carly, I'm going to throw it to you, and let's see if we have people that would be willing to weigh in on what the fences are.
Sure. And we were going to, I hear everyone commenting in the chat that the chat function's not working as we had described. So it said to chat to everyone, but there is no everyone and they can't see each other's chats. So what we're going to do right now is bring everybody into the meeting. So it'll take us just a minute to do that.
Okay.
And then everyone should be able to see everything. If you can, please keep yourself on mute and keep your camera off. We will still be using the chat function to everyone to indicate that you'd like to speak, and then we'll call your name, and then you can turn on your camera, turn off mute, and provide your comment. And then when you're done speaking, we just ask that you please turn back off your camera and put yourself back on mute so that we can all keep hearing each other.
Great. Thanks, Carly.
So it'll be just a second as we get that going.
Okay.
Everyone should now be in the meeting as a panelist.
Thank you. Okay, I have my first I'd like to speak, and I have it with Andrew. Andrew, go ahead and turn on your camera.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, Andrew. We can hear you. Go right ahead.
I am starting my video. It's going to be a little dark because I'm driving.
Oh, you be careful.
Of course. Thank you very much for allowing me to join. I do have a question, and
Sure.
that is, I want to challenge your assumptions.
Yep.
What makes you think there are any barriers here in Golden? Are we trying to develop a problem that does not exist in Golden? Now, I'm not talking about the larger community outside of Golden.
Yeah.
I'm talking about Golden. I've lived all across the United States and traveled. I've seen a lot of places where there are a lot of barriers. I don't see them in Golden, so I want to challenge your assumption because I don't believe there are fences here in Golden.
Well, that's great. So you won't be challenging my assumption because I don't have one. I don't know if you have barriers or not, but I do want to pose the question in case there are people that do believe there are barriers. So in your opinion, there aren't any. That's a very important opinion for us to hear. I'm glad you raised it because I don't want you to think I have assumptions about that. I do not.
All right, good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Where's the flow?
Carly, it looks like you may have people in line, but I see Marlena is asking in chat if they could speak to.
Sure. Marlena?
Yes, sorry, can you hear me?
We can, Marlena.
All right, and I see in the chat from also Miss Allison White. My initial thought was housing cost as a barrier and cost to living in Golden. It is very expensive, at least to me. And I know that lens is different for every individual. I'm not sure if Allison would like to speak. I can read her chat though. Let's see, it says access to public transportation and then access to mental health care and things of that nature. So.
Yeah, Marlena, thank you so much for that. So Allison does say, similar to some of your comments, I agree with housing costs. I'm a local business owner, Aaliyah says. Therapist and can't afford to live here anymore. Bill Fisher says, I do believe there are barriers in Golden, both historic and present. So we see a couple about housing costs. I'm not sure a very white community feels welcoming to people of color. I'm curious how that feels for those who might want to live here. I also see in chat access to healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate food as maybe a barrier or a thing to be thinking about too. There's comments, and you can see this in chat, history such as past KKK activities, mental health care access, more about housing costs and living here. The denial of the fact that there might even be barriers could be a barrier. Those are things in chat. So continue to watch what's in chat. Carly, do we have anyone else that would want to speak?
I see Paul and Marilyn have their camera on.
Okay.
Paul, did you want to speak?
Yes. One of the things that we don't have as a wall is there's hardly any racial diversity in Golden. And also the housing cost is too high. And because of the lack of racial diversity, there's not opportunity for people of diverse backgrounds to get together. And I believe that one of the most serious problems is to solve racial issues, you have to interact with each other. And how do you get mechanisms that allow the races to interact? And I think that's a vital question, for me at least, is a vital question.
Paul, thank you. Thank you, Paul, for raising that. I mean, you bring up an important point, something that I mentioned a little earlier, that when we start to talk about racial equity, we can't forget about the important role that diversity plays. And so if we don't have a mix of different kinds of races and identities, how does that actually happen well in a community? So I really appreciate you raising that. Thank you so much. I'm reading in chat from Catherine Davis. Previously, I lived in Brooklyn. I moved to Golden in June. I've not seen a single Black person since moving here. That's a barrier. I also reading there's racism and a lack of cultural competency that affects people in Golden. It sort of goes back to Paul's comment about if we don't have difference, identity difference, racial ethnic difference in the community, it's harder to have that manifest. Thank you for that. Did we have another speaker?
Janine? Sorry.
Oh, are you calling me, Jeannie?
Yes, Jeannie. Sorry, it was still on my screen.
Okay. I was just going to echo some of the comments that have already been shared. And I think a lot about our homogenous representation and our city's leadership. While I appreciate the work we do, from my perspective, it's a largely white group of leaders. And I also think about representation in other leadership positions like businesses in Golden. From my perspective, they look largely white. And so when I think about how do we increase equity, I think about the diversity and voices of leadership, and that's a place to start. And I'm not seeing that in Golden. And it's a disservice to our ability to be equitable, I think.
Yeah, Jeannie, thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. It raises that we still have to look at the systems. It's not just the community, but it's all of our systems too, and how those systems are reflected too. Thank you so much for that. I see something in chat from Ronnie that says, I've observed visitors to Golden who are people of color being looked at with hostility by people who probably don't assume that they're residents, or maybe they're residents. So continue to look at the chat room. Lots of things that are supporting and different perspectives about what you're hearing from our speakers. Let's go to our next speaker.
Linda, would you like to speak?
If you please, I can't see everything. I I know that there are homeless students and families who reside in Golden, and I know that we support these students and families.
Yeah. Thank you, Linda. Is there another speaker?
Begonia?
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. The first one is related to the comment about leadership in the city of Golden. Um, I really appreciate this opportunity and the fact that you brought Dr. Tyler to talk to us today. But I wanted to know if the city is planning on revisiting their onboarding and hiring processes, as well as their inclusive practices within the city of Golden, to ensure that not only diversity, the representation of everybody is reflected on city leadership, but also that there is an environment for inclusion.
Begona, thank you for that. I think you're asking a very important question. I certainly don't have the answer to it, but let me just tell you this. A part of this process is for city leaders to hear what you're saying so that they can figure out what the action steps will be. I think what you just said would be a very important thing to be talking about. So I don't want you to think that your question goes unanswered, but your question becomes a part of what informs the next steps in this process. I appreciate you raising that. It kind of goes along, Begona, with what I'm reading in the chat from Jill. And it says education or as a fence. Our teachers are all white, and that's what our kids assume then is normal. That's what happens. It gets normalized when you only see a certain thing. I have to tell you, the opposite was true for me. I grew up in the segregated South. I'm old enough to tell you I grew up in the segregated South, and in segregated schools in that time, we had the worst of resources. We didn't have much of anything. And that then became my norm. Because it was the only thing I saw, I thought that was normal. So we don't want to normalize things that are not just either way. And so I appreciate you sharing that. Marlena, I see your comment that hopefully this leads to an action plan. Absolutely. Jim, I'm going to get with you in a minute on implicit or unconscious bias too. I see it, and I'll get to it in a minute. William, were you wanting to speak? I think you're muted. That's going to be the quote of the day. I think you're muted.
Okay, how about now?
Okay, you're great. I can hear you.
I'm computer challenged. My question is if some of the governmental representatives know or could tell us what the actual census figures are for Golden and what the minority population is.
Yeah. So maybe there's a smart person that represents the city on this call that just knows that off the top of their head. Maybe if you do, you can put that in chat for us, and that might answer William's question. So we'll see if somebody knows that right off the top of their head. William, if we don't get it tonight, we'll get it. Let me, before we have another speaker, let me get to a question Jim Halderman sent me, because I think it's an important thing to think about as we're talking about this. It is about conscious and unconscious bias. So one of the things that sits in the middle of what we're talking about right now are our own biases about what's real, what's not real, what is not. Those biases just come with us. The ones that we talk about most often are the unconscious ones. We always want to talk about unconscious bias because you don't know you have these biases, and it's like a runaway train when you don't know you have a bias. And so we talk about this because we have to be thinking about at the individual level how to mitigate that from happening. So it's complicated, it's complex, but I've got a simple, unscientific way for you to get at it. What you should start with when you're tackling bias is not to try to figure out what your unconscious ones are, but to start with your conscious ones. What are the prejudices, the stereotypes that you already know you have? You know you have it. So name those. It's private work because some of them could be really bad. But name them. What are the conscious prejudices, discrimination, stereotypes you know you have? I don't like them. I don't like that group, whatever that is. If you can name what your conscious biases are, they typically are attached to what might be happening unconsciously. They're always linked. And so let me just give you a quick example, and then we'll go to the next questions. A quick example is if I share with you one of my conscious biases, I'm going to go out on a limb here. One of my conscious biases, prejudice that I know I have, is I can't stand people that don't want to learn. Now, I don't mean people that don't want to go to school. I mean people that think they know everything, and then they think they don't need to listen to anything you say. Them. That's my conscious bias. And I feel like I could spot you a mile away. So I want you to know that's what a conscious bias can look like. Now, the link to the unconscious. I want you to think about for a minute what I might be doing unconsciously to people that I've identified as not wanting to learn. I bet it would take you seconds to think about what I might be doing to them unconsciously, like ignoring them, dismissing them, discounting them, not making eye contact with them. You can name them in seconds what I might be doing unconsciously. It is a quick, unscientific way for you to challenge what you might be doing unconsciously based on the things that are conscious prejudices that you might have. So continue to be thinking about that even through this process. How can you disrupt those biases that you might have had all of your life in order for us to advance the things that we're talking about tonight? I want to thank who put this in the chat room. There's some of the data that you just asked for a minute ago. Kia put some census data in the chat room that helps us a little bit. Some quick facts about all of the cities, and you can see what's going on in Golden. At least you can get a general picture of what the racial ethnic breakouts are there. Thank you for doing that. Do we have any other speakers?
I'm not seeing anybody quite yet.
Okay.
I would like to speak.
Oh,
My
go
name is
ahead. Go right ahead.
My name is Julie Morales. I've been putting it in the chat box. I don't know if there's, for some reason, it's not working. But anyway, and I don't know, my video doesn't appear to be working. But I am a resident of Golden for about 12 years now, and I'm a person of color. And one of the things, I'm glad that you mentioned this, your examples that you just shared, Nita, because one of the things that I think it's hard for folks who are not people of color to understand the being on the other end of on the receiving end of microaggressions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what you were describing is a microaggression. We're doing some racial equity work at my my organization that I work for right now. And that is one of the areas I think that it's a little bit difficult for folks who are kind of they're in the privileged class, essentially, to understand what it feels like to have little microaggressions happen to you, and how it is an emotional drain and can be traumatic to try and address these things. And I have actually had that happen to me on a community group that I was in Golden, working on the USA Pro Cycling Challenge. And my question would be, how do you educate folks about that kind of thing when they've never experienced such an issue?
Yeah, Julie, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It saddens me, of course, and I'm really aligned with what you're saying. You know, I've spent my entire life, I believe, working hard and being committed to trying to help people along in some of those processes. I think when you live in a world that has normalized the very things that oppress you, It's harder to teach because it's other people's norm. It's painful and harmful to me, and it's somebody else's norm. And so I think the undoing of that is what we're in the middle of right now. And I think it's going to happen one person and one system at a time. It's one of the reasons I really believe work has to start with our systems. I think we have spent at least most of my life chipping away at people and trying to influence their hearts and minds. I'm really more interested now in what we're going to do in our systems. Can we name in our systems where we have racial inequities, and will we commit to doing something about it? I really think that's where I am, and I think that's what it's going to take. Otherwise, I think we're still at one person at a time, which is okay, but not in an isolated way. The systems work really has to happen. I'm looking forward to doing that. Peter, I see a message from you in the chat that you wanted to speak. You go right ahead.
Well, thank you, and thank you for this call, this visit today. It's very important, I think, and Julie's points were really well made. One of the things about the fence, right, is that people look at the fence from either side, and I think one of the things that happens is that people don't know how to communicate across the fence because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing or alienating, and then the message becomes, and it's really out of fear sometimes. But then the message becomes, I'm dismissing the issue rather than I want to tackle the issue, but I don't know how.
Yes, I agree with you, Peter, about that. The talking across the fence is hard. So let me just tell you something that's really complicated. I think it's complicated. So, we're in a climate, particularly after George Floyd's murder, where we spent a lot of time talking about the system of policing. We ought to be talking about all the systems, but we're talking about the system of policing. And so people are on a spectrum about how they feel about policing and how we ought to go about being in relationship with policing. The statement that I want to make about that is when you commit to racial equity work, there is a requirement that we have conversations. And we're going to have to talk in order to change systems. It doesn't mean you have to value the system that you're talking to, but there is some dialogue that's going to have to happen. There are some parts of the system that will be absolutely dismantled. There's some parts of the system that will require some design thinking so that you build something else. There's some parts of systems that will just be replaced. All of that is a part of racial equity work. It is not about ripping down everything. It comes in a continuum about how the work looks in a racial equity strategy. So I do agree with you that there is dialogue that needs to happen. I appreciate you bringing that up. Andrew, let me tackle what Andrew has put in the chat room. I'm trying to keep up with some of these. I'm going to ask you to try to keep up with them with me because it's great. It's great to do that. It's great to hear what your colleagues and your neighbors are saying. It's important not to make broad generalizations that only people of color experience prejudice and therefore cannot understand it, which isn't true. Many people experience religious, ethnic, and other prejudices. Perhaps it is better to ask the question about what prejudice each of us has experienced. I appreciate that. So I am clear that prejudice doesn't discriminate. I'm very clear about that. So everybody on this call has probably experienced some kind of prejudice. And it saddens me because I don't want a world where people have to experience that at all. The centering on race is intentional. So it doesn't mean we don't care about what other people have experienced. It is intentional that we're talking about race, and I'm going to tell you why. We're talking about race because that is what is systemic and institutionalized in our systems in a very bad way. Racism is systemic. Racism is institutionalized. We have built entire systems in this country to keep out Black people. That's as clear as I can get about it. And so, yes, we have misogyny. Yes, we have homophobia. Yes, we have xenophobia. It doesn't denounce or dismiss any of the other isms and phobias. But why we're centering on this is that we've built an entire system to keep Black people out. And if you go back in history, which I want to invite you to do, every single one of those systems that were built to keep Black people out way back then still have residual impact today. And we need to be talking about that. It wasn't 400 years ago. It wasn't 80 years ago. It still exists today. So if you take data points around systems like poll taxes, if I went back to poll taxes, I remember when there were poll taxes, and you fast forward the residual of what poll taxes have done today, you get today's voter suppression. So if I go through every one of those things that was intentionally built in our system, there is something that's reflective of that today, and that's why we're centering on race. I don't want anybody to think that we don't care about anything else, because it's not true. The reason you're hearing about race so much is that we keep talking about it a little and then going back to our status quo and our systems and how we've operated. And now is the time for us to get these systems in a place that we can proudly say has racial equity in it, and it lifts all boats because we do that. So I appreciate you saying that. This came up a lot. If I can also just be really frank with you, this came up a lot last year with Black Lives Matter. And we saw that. You saw that in Golden. Not everybody was on board with having signs that said Black Lives Matter, and not everybody understands what Black Lives Matter means and why all lives don't matter. Now, here's the deal. In Nita's world, it's the only one I know, all lives do matter. I just want mine to be included in that. That's what Black Lives Matter means. It's really Black Lives Matter too, because we've built so many systems that articulated that they didn't. So I want you to know that this spectrum that we're on right now and trying to understand how to activate in a moment like this has to do with us really understand what is being called for, what's being asked for, and honestly, knowing our history. If you dismiss your history, then it's harder to wrap your head around this. I call what we're living in right now the recency effect. The recency effect is us remembering what's in front of us a lot more than we remember things that got presented to us before. And so a part of that is it makes us forget some of our history because we're living in today's episode or today's snapshot. So I also want to remind you, encourage you to not live in a snapshot. What is happening today has tentacles to what already happened in the past. Yeah, I've got 3 adult children. I always tell them, pay it forward, play it backwards. I always want them to tie what's going on today to what already happened so they're better informed for what needs to happen in the future. I want to invite you all to do that too, is to not forget that probably whatever is happening today has a linkage to something in the past. Michelle, you're saying it well. Blacks were historically blocked from building family intergenerational wealth because of discrimination in housing and lending practices. Guess what? When Black soldiers were in World War I and World War II and they came back home, guess what? They couldn't even buy a house. They just served the country. They couldn't buy a house. There were no mortgage lenders for them. Generational wealth compromised because of that. And so when we fast forward and you look at the economic standing of Black communities now, and depending on where those communities are, we still see some residual of that. So that's an important thing to talk about.
Nita, I have a few comments that came directly to me. There are some people that are having a difficult time getting into the group chat, and so I just wanted to share these with you.
Yeah, please.
From Eric Vera, it says, there are always many ways to experience prejudice. The unfortunate situation is people of color and women can experience it before an introduction upon first glance.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And then another one is, can you describe a systemic change that would help move the needle?
Yeah, let me describe one, and it's not perfect, but let me describe what a systemic change might look like because it's real. I have a client, a large healthcare organization. They wouldn't mind me saying it. It's Kaiser Permanente. One of the things they've been challenged with, as long as I can remember, is they were not recruiting enough physicians of color. They just weren't coming through the traditional medical schools. And so Kaiser tried all kinds of programs and internships and the things that we always come up with, and it wasn't increasing the number of physicians of color. And depending on where you are in the country, Kaiser is serving big communities of color. So they wanted their physician teams to reflect some of the communities they were serving. And so after trying all kinds of things, the things that we're familiar with, they made a big systemic decision. And that was, if people of color are not coming through the traditional medical schools, what we should do is build our own medical schools and set our own way of doing it. And maybe even take care of the tuition of people that are coming through so they don't end up with six-figure student loan debt when they graduate, so they can build wealth. So that's exactly what they did. It's one of those really innovative things to do that was risky that they launched last year. So Kaiser Permanente has the Kaiser Permanente Medical School. They can grow their own physicians now and attract in the way that makes sense for them. And it should help to increase the racial ethnic demographic in medicine, at least in their system. So it's just an example of having to not tear down somebody's system, but to use some design thinking to create a brand new one.
And Nita, just a few more comments that came just to me. These are not questions, but comments. One says, thank you for magnificently explaining prejudice versus racism. And another said, I hope that this is available following the discussion, as Nita is sharing so much that I would like to share with others who are unable to attend. And I can say that it definitely will be, and we will put the details on how people can watch it later on in the chat box. Thank you, Nita.
You're welcome. Thank you. I appreciate that. William, I'm seeing your face again. Did you want to say something, or are you just sharing your beautiful face? Okay. Unmute yourself.
Where's my little arrow? Here it is. Finished reading a book called How the South Won the Civil War. I'm from the East originally, and my involvement with racial and discrimination issues is based on a very East Coast perspective. The point of this book is that a political alliance between the West and the South developed because they shared a discrimination history, but in the West, it was focused on Mexicans and on Indians and on Orientals, Japanese or Chinese. And I think I'm not sure. I'm new more or less in Golden, and I'm not sure how much of the residue of that history of discrimination still exists in the West, and this author paints the West with a very broad brush. I, for example, coming from the East, I never heard about the Sand Creek Massacre. Probably those who are Westerners here or who have had time in Denver know about it. That's a part of American history I never knew about.
Yeah.
So my sort of question or issue to put before the group is, to what extent does residue of discrimination still exist on those other populations?
Yeah. William, I appreciate you sharing that. I think there's residue of all kinds of things. I mean, if we really were to start digging, almost every group is impacted in some way, in a residual way, from things from our past. And you also raised something else that's really important, and that is each of us has learned enough about the U.S. history to be dangerous. And depending on where you're from, you only learned a part of it. And I'm learning that more and more the more places I visit in our country, that each of us learned a segment of the total U.S. history. Growing up in the segregated South, you can imagine what part of the history I learned, and then there were other parts that were missed. And then when I get to other parts of the country, what I have to share floors people. When I got to Colorado 25 years ago, people were surprised when I had pictures of the Klan burning down churches right in Denver. They didn't know that existed in Denver. So we have a lot of dialogue that we need to be having about exactly what you're talking about. And that is, what is the history of the places that we're in, and to whom did that history not smile fondly on? We have to start talking about that. I appreciate that. Okay, my friends, I want you to stay in the chat room and look at the great things that are, they're great conversations that are going on in there. I'm going to go to another question, though, that I want to raise for you. So it's a little offshoot of the first question. Thank you for all that you did to name some of those fences or barriers or inequities that get in the way. Now I want you to get a little bit more crystallized in what we're talking about. So the question is, in your opinion, what are the priority areas to focus on to advance racial equity in our community? So what are the priority areas? I'm going to ask you to dream a little here, and let's just get real specific. If you had to be at a whiteboard writing down what these priority areas are, what are they? What are the priority areas that we need to focus on to advance racial equity in our communities? Susan, did you want to speak? I'm seeing your video. Susan Ote? No? Maybe not. Carly, do you have anyone that wants to speak on that one?
I don't see anyone yet.
Okay. I'm seeing a lot of things coming up in the chat room. Scholarships for entrepreneurs of color, hiring practices. I see affordable housing again. That is coming up quite a bit too. Hiring practices, the education system, affordable housing, that's coming up quite a bit. So one of the things that will be really important, I know you know this, is to get some of these down to some priority areas. What are the things that are most important to the community? These are the things that you want to focus on to advance racial equity in the community. And you have to get crystallized a little bit on that, because here's the reality. You're not going to be able to work on everything. One of the things I can tell you in my work that happens is people get exhausted just saying the word racial equity when they think about the gravity of what it's going to take to do it. And so I want to head that off for you. You won't be able to boil the whole ocean, but if you can get really specific in the city of Golden about the 5-6 things you really want to influence, that's the way to go in racial equity work. And then when you get one thing accomplished, you can add a new one to the list. Don't try to do them all. It just doesn't work that way. I love some of the conversations in chat. Ronnie Rosenbaum, right on, honest conversations with people that disagree is important. You want to know something about disagreeing? I was in Grand Junction, 2019. I was meeting with like neo-Nazi people. I don't know what you call them. Yeah, neo-Nazi folks, to talk about race. And it was brokered by the police chief to just be in a room to talk about it. Michelle, you're right. I felt really brave, a little bit nervous, but a little brave. I agree that we got to start talking across some real hard lines if we can. Some honest conversations, and that's what we had, honest conversations about race. What I learned in the process, and this isn't always the case, what I learned in the process is we've just created narrative about all kinds of things. We're just making up stuff, and so people are operating on this narrative that's really made up, the things that we've made up about each other, and so I really appreciate that. I see from Tamara, Orndorff. We need to encourage conversations to address issues of retention and recruitment of Black teachers and leaders. Absolutely. I worked so hard in my work, Tamara. I'm glad you have brought that up. In my career, just trying to recruit Black people in particular to even come to Colorado. That's the problem that we have in our medical schools and our nursing schools, and having people come from other places to Colorado is hard because they don't see people that look like them. And that was even hard for me when I got here, is leaving Atlanta to come to Colorado. It takes some finessing. So I appreciate you saying you say that. Let's see, what else do we have in the chat room? Engaging those who have not been negatively impacted to become advocates, to become anti-racist and pro-equity. Hey, this is a good one. It's sort of a trigger for something I want to talk about. So, we talk a lot about allyship, or you've probably started to hear people talk about being an accomplice. So let me just say a couple of things. An ally. We need to teach folks how to be an ally. So I want to do, this is like hooked on phonics for a minute here. I want you to go from being a noun to a verb. So it's not enough to say I'm an ally. You have to do something. To say you're an ally doesn't actually call for you to do anything. It might denote what you stand for, but it doesn't actually mean you did something. When you really think about what we need more people that can work in a collective to do something. And so when I think about allyship, I think about actions, being an accomplice, having people know exactly what they're going to be working on. Michelle, you're right, encouraging people to not just say, I'm not a racist, but to identify as anti-racist, which means you're actually doing something to eradicate the places that you see racism. So I wanted to raise that. I wanted to raise that as a different way to look at allyship and how to be an anti-racist. Is I want you to think about it being verb work, action work. What can you do should be the question. No matter how small, no matter how big, it is the action that really counts. Andrew's saying, what makes us different from the other? And that's the basis of prejudice, all kinds, race, economic, education, career. That's exactly right. Differences are the root of a lot of these problems. We normalized whiteness, and then everything that wasn't white then became an issue. And that's been since the beginning of time. We have normalized whiteness. So there's a really interesting experiment I want you to think about or take a look at. It's called the 1940s doll test. Some of you know about that. It was 1947. It was a social experiment where these researchers wanted to figure out how very young African American children were being impacted by segregation, by the system of segregation. Now, these little kids were ages 3 to 7 years old. And so they used these two dolls. They used a white doll and a black doll. And so for these little kids, they would say, which doll is the smartest? Which doll is the cutest? Which doll is the nicest? Which doll is the smartest? They would ask these questions. And so over and over and over again, these little black kids would hold up the white doll for those positive attributes. And then when they'd say, which one's the dumbest? The meanest, the ugliest. Over and over and over again, these black kids would hold up the black doll. So this experiment was just repeated over and over and over again. And then in 2010, somebody else repeated the same experiment, same outcomes. So I want you to know that 1940s doll test is something else for us to be thinking about when we think about difference, that it gets acculturated. This thing that we called internalized racism as young as 3 years old. And not only will it happen to black kids who think poorly of themselves based on the societal cues that they're getting, the same thing would happen to white kids. If you reversed the experiment, you might find that those biases are setting up in them at these very young ages too. So I want you to really think about how this gets set up really early on. It's really important. Jim, I think you're asking how long before we can remove race or ethnicity and those kind of things. I don't know if that's going to happen in my lifetime. I'm just guessing. I'm just really guessing. I think as long as we're different and as long as we have these really big difference in lived experiences, we're going to always have these labels. I got to tell you too, in the US, we just function in labels of all kinds. It's how we keep anything straight. I'm just making that up. But I think that I'm not sure that we'll get rid of labels in my lifetime. I sometimes wish that we could. And at the same time, I want to wait until everybody fully understands what our identities have, how they've manifested in our systems. I want everybody to understand that well. I want to just find out before I move on to the next question, if there's anybody that would be willing to speak on priority areas. Here's your chance. We want city leaders to hear you prioritize this. Some of this is already in chat, but if there's anybody that wants to speak about it, it'd be great. Priority areas of where we need to focus to advance racial equity. I just want to make sure I don't miss anybody. Great. Okay. If you decide you want to speak on it, you certainly can. I'm
sorry.
Go right ahead.
This is Julie Morales. I got my video to work finally. I think one of the things that I would say, and again, I'm doing some racial equity work within my organization right now, and we've had a lot of discussions around where do you start. And one of the things I think that's important is some kind of doing some individual self-reflection, some kind of individual self-reflection piece, because the fact is, I mean, some people have mentioned this already. The fact is that we all, we all have privilege to some degree. There is, I'm a middle class Latina woman, right? I have an education. I've had privilege that comes with having that education. Some people have privilege because of the whiteness of their skin and, their, all of the opportunities that were afforded them because of their development within a middle class household. We all have a certain amount of privilege. And in some ways, I think that's the great equalizer, is because if you can acknowledge that, yes, I have privilege too, what am I going to do with that privilege? How can I use that, as somebody mentioned in the chat, to be an ally to people of color, to those who are less fortunate than me or are not getting the same opportunities as me? I think that self-reflective piece is a really good place to start. So when you say, what are our priority areas? I feel like that's something that everybody could benefit from our leadership, in our community, to our, the teachers in our schools, to, I just think that really is something that everybody could understand, that we all bring privilege to the table, and that somehow helps people to understand if there are some that are not getting those same privileges that we kind of take for granted.
Thank you so much for that, Julie. I appreciate that. And to support some of the things that you're saying, in the chat room are people that are listing some books that are great reads on how to support that self-reflection work. Really, really important. Thank you for that. Michelle, were you going to say something?
Yes, I would love to. I would also like to share, I'd like to say that I'm very grateful that the City of Golden has taken some really important steps. Having you come and have this conversation is super important, and I'm grateful that the city is doing this. This is great. They've also made some great steps within the police department. So I want to acknowledge the work that they are doing. And say, let's keep going on it. The police department is doing important work. They need to keep doing it. The City of Golden is considering some affordable housing initiatives. That's awesome. Let's commit some real fund and energy to that. I would love to see that. I would also love to see City of Golden take a look at their HR practices to see if if the way we're hiring people is encouraging diversity or discouraging it, because there's ways of hiring that matter. And then also, once we have staff, are we doing anti-bias training? Are we doing implicit bias training? Are we doing workplace diversity training, and also understanding the community and how to make Golden a more welcoming place? So I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for sharing your beautiful family with us too. I appreciate that. It's important in this process of thinking about where to focus the work is to not lose sight of where you're already starting to do some work. I call it the inventory. So one of the most important things to do, especially in a city, is to take those 4 words that I always talk about: diversity, inclusion, equity, equality, and start taking a little bit of an inventory on what you're doing in each category. And it will show you where you've got some big opportunities to do even more work. Don't assume you're doing nothing, because you're doing something. And it's nice for the community to see the degree to which you are, and it comes through really starting to document. I know you've done a lot of work. I know you've done police department work, and the JEDI team out of City Council, and the Golden Anti-Racism Collective, and their block captains, and there are things all over the city of Golden that are happening. And in tandem, when you put those things together, that's where you really start to see the fruits of the advancement of racial equity and all kinds of other equity, when you start putting all those things together. But communication across the groups will be really important, so that you are doing the very best job that you can to work in a collective. It's really important. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Paul, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yes, I do. I would like some discussion about intergenerational wealth disparities, and how massive that disparity is, and how could policy affect that problem. And I'm thinking of things like, for instance, what's it called? Racial reparations.
Mm-hmm.
And how might that concept work if you were to deposit money into a bank account or a fund's 5,000, as an example, $5,000 when a baby is born, that can grow during the lifetime. As that's just one thing I think of, but there can be all sorts of ways of doing that. But that problem is massive, and it seems like it must be addressed. So, what are ideas about how that could be addressed?
Yeah, wow. Paul, now you have just added 8 more hours to this time together.
Sorry.
But yeah, I'm with you in what you're talking about. What are the things that got in the way of the ability to have intergenerational wealth is the question. I'm not sure that everybody understands what happened. I think it all starts with, do we know what got in the way of that in the first place? And I got to tell you, one of the best books around that to me is The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein. The Color of Law talks about exactly what you're talking about here. If we don't start talking about what those systems were that we intentionally put in place to keep Black people out, then we have not done our job in figuring out the answer to your question. I mean, we intentionally made redlining. We would not give mortgages to people for their homes. And guess what? When you don't give people mortgages to buy their homes, what do you think happens to the schools that are in those communities? They're not funded. So The Color of Law looks at the intersection of what happened with redlining and our educational system and beyond. It actually has some Denver inferences in it. It talks about the Park Hill community in that book too. So I would love to open that question up to the audience. Paul, if they're willing to weigh in a little bit about what do we do about intergenerational wealth, given the types of systems that we built that made that almost impossible in the past. Anybody have any thoughts about that could weigh in on Paul's question? Just turn your video on and unmute yourself and go for it. William, unmute yourself.
Unmute myself. Where did that little guy go? Oh, there it is. You hear me now?
Yeah, try it now.
William, it sounds like you have two microphones on at the same time, or two sources, so it's echoing pretty badly.
As I said when I first.
It sounds like, William, you've got a phone and a computer mic going at the same time. So they're echoing really badly, so we can't hear you. Well, you keep working on that. Let me see if we have someone else that wants to weigh in. Carol? It says Carol Cameron.
Yeah, this is Don Cameron. Carol's sitting in the background there. This is a lot of people on this call know that I've done some research on the racist zoning in Golden, and I also did a calculation that I haven't widely shared. But you can basically say if Golden's only 1.8% black, but the surrounding county is 5%, then that gap could be due to prior racism. And if you're talking reparations, and you look at the home equity involved, and you look at average home prices and rates of ownership and all this, you get a very reasonable number of reparations of only $30 million in Golden is what it would take to fix that gap that may be due to our prior racist policies. That sounds like a lot of money, but in the scheme of things, for all the ills that it has done, I don't think it's bad, and it's just a stake in the ground. It's a discussion point. So anyway, I'll wrap it up there and just say people are thinking about it.
Yeah, thank you for that, Don. I really appreciate it. You're right, people are thinking about it, and I think some people are at odds with it. I just finished up my term as the chair of the board for the Denver Foundation, and there's a reparations fund that was started at the Denver Foundation, a group of donors who have said basically what you've said. If you went community to community and you did a little bit of math, there is a way to solve a problem, or at least create the footing that was compromised years ago through practices that were racist practices. So thanks for that. I appreciate it. Any other thoughts about this comment, reparations, or how do we ensure intergenerational wealth given what's happened? Allison, I see your comment in the chat room. I think it's also important for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to define what reparations would look like for them. Thank you for saying that. I think people are designing strategies for reparations, and no one's really asking the question to the people that it might impact. I appreciate you raising that. Does property valuation still include race as a metric? Ooh, Christina, question. I just finished working with a young lady the other day that was struggling, not with sort of with property valuation, with what appraisers are doing when they walk into the house of a person of color. And are they appraising houses at the levels that they're appraising a white person's house? And when it was all said and done, she had it reappraised. There was $180,000 difference in what the appraiser 1 and appraiser 2 had done in that house. So that's an interesting thing for us to be thinking about. William, did you get your mic? Did you get your mic done?
How's that?
Yeah,
There's still an awful lot of feedback, isn't there?
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback. I'm not sure what it is. It looks like most people are mic'd. Sometimes that gets in the way. So I'm not sure what it is. Well, if you feel up to it, stick it in the chat room and maybe we can still hear your voice on that. There's some really important things that are going on in the chat room right now. Buying a home. Home buying is critical. I absolutely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you there. So keep it going. Let me move to the next question. It might be the question that sort of maybe it summarizes a lot. But the question is, what could city leaders do that would really make a difference in advancing racial equity? Now, you've talked about some of the priority areas and the fences, but specifically, what could city leaders do that would make a difference in advancing racial equity? What are your thoughts about that? What would city leaders do? This is the part where you talk. Thank you, Jill. Diversify the council. I see that in the chat. Prioritize funding for equity efforts like we do other necessary community services. Great. Thank you for that, Sandra. Other thoughts about what city leaders could do? It would be nice to see a family with more diversity on the cover of the Golden magazine instead of always featuring a white family. Yes, good suggestion, and with the caveat that we're not tokenizing people. We don't want to just stick families of color up there just because. Equity audits, lots of good for processes and policies, lots of good advice, representation, and invest in funding to address some of these barriers. For example, funding affordable housing policies to support affordable housing. Yeah. Diverse opinions, including those. Fund racial equity programs, city HR practices that came up a little bit earlier too. You could purchase and donate land for affordable housing initiatives. There's a lot of housing and policy work in here. So really, really good examples here. Police practices and community relations, transportation, all of the major systems in the city. It's just getting focused on those would be nice. There's Michelle, you put community relations in there. I don't want to put you on the spot, but this might sort of be that. When you say community relations, what does that mean for you? When we talk about what city leaders can do, a part of yours is community relations. Tell me what you mean, Michelle.
Yeah, so actually the police, the Golden Police Department is considering having stronger initiatives between the police department and the community. So having a community liaison within the police department, but then also having community members on some of the review boards that they have, like use of force review boards and that sort of thing. So specifically a police department community relations is what that comment was focused on.
Okay, that clears it up. I appreciate that. I want to make sure we capture that so that we don't make up the meaning of what you're saying as we think about all of these really wonderful insights to how to advance racial equity. Tamara talks about International Week, celebrating and honoring all cultures through music, education, art, food, etc. What a nice initiative around the topic of diversity Tamara is describing there. This is why I wanted everybody to understand that in racial equity work, there's still diversity things that you'll do and inclusion things and equality things. That's a great example of a diversity-centric initiative that would be really important too. Any efforts, Jill says this, any efforts to affordable housing need to be affordable to purchase, not just rent. Amen. I appreciate that. Yes. That's how you get family wealth. So if there were a strategy in Golden around intergenerational family wealth as an espoused value, then everything that you built would be around helping people amass that. So I really appreciate that. I really appreciate that. Stronger connections to public transit. We are at the end of the train line, but not tied well to downtown Golden. It's important to be thinking about that. What did we learn from school integration to help with racial equity efforts? Oh, wow. Joyce, I want you to talk about that. I'm putting Joyce on the spot right now. Joyce, would you be willing to talk about that for a minute? I think that's a powerful consideration for us. Joyce probably just ran away now that I just did that. All right. Joyce, if you feel up to it, I'd love to hear you talk about that more. It's great. Give priority. Michelle says give priority to affordable housing. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah. Ed and Merity here. I know there are some communities in Colorado, some very well-to-do ones like Aspen, where when somebody builds a bunch of houses, they have to dedicate a certain fraction of them to low price. So you can build a bunch of houses that cost $700,000, then you have to build a bunch that costs $70,000. And that is something that the city of Golden could do, because you look around Golden now, there are all these houses being built. I go for a bike ride along 8th Avenue and there's these huge number of apartments. And I don't know what the deal was between those owners and the city of Golden, but this is something where the city of Golden could have stepped in and say, you have to dedicate 10%, 20% of those to people that are making under $80,000 a year, under $50,000 a year. And this won't directly translate to color, but it could.
Yeah, thank you for that.
All economics.
All economics. That's exactly right. Thank you so much for that. Well, and it's an example of maybe a starting place. It works to some degree in Aspen. I mean, even having in Aspen, I remember them when they started building the employee housing because employees couldn't afford to live there. I mean, every now and then you just have to build something that augments the problem in the positive. And every now and then you got to create something that's just new. I appreciate you sharing that. Michelle is saying increase, these are moving so fast, I keep losing my space. Increase transparency in the approval process for new developments. Yes. And I read one, let's see, get Golden businesses to commit to hiring people of color. Yeah. I want you to go in and read some of these. These are just great. DEI and anti-bias education conversations in all of our schools. Really important too. So I do think that you have raised over and over again in this conversation these bookends that are everything from we need to educate earlier, and we need to keep educating. And on the other end of the bookend is there are policy changes that need to happen. There are systems changes that need to happen. All of that is in the body of work we call racial equity work. And so one of the things I want you all to be thinking about is my next question. You can keep answering the one about what you want city leaders to do, but I've got one more question I want to ask you. I want you to think real deeply about this one. What would it take to more fully engage you in the process of advancing racial equity? In other words, what I'm really asking is, what do you need to do the work of racial equity? What do you need? What can the city help with? What do you need? Because the reality is the city is going to have to do some work, but at an individual level, we're going to have to do some work. Have we really thought about what we will need to advance that on a personal level? So any thinking about what you need? What do you want? What do you need for you to be able to help to advance racial equity work? Any thoughts there? Did Joyce Jennings need to be unmuted? I'm just seeing that in the chat room. Pamela, you want to share?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah,
Well, how was it?
my camera's funny because it's in the hinge of my computer, so you're looking at my chin. I can't help that.
That's okay.
So I want to get involved, but I need like a roadmap of what to do. I mean, sure, I can self-reflect and work on myself, but like you say, that's one by one personal things. To change systems, I mean, I can go out and vote and work for what I think are progressive leaders, but for myself to help change a system, I'm like, I don't know what to do. I need a roadmap.
Yeah. So Pamela, what you're saying is not a ridiculous thing. I gotta tell you that. I think we also are pretty accustomed to getting a roadmap. I mean, if you think about the movements that we've been in, we always got a checklist about what we were supposed to do, and racial equity is really a little different than that. It doesn't come with a checklist, but there are groups that are doing work. And so you've got some. The Golden Anti-Racism Collective is one of those. You probably have groups that are within other organizations that are doing equity work. There are probably some local schools that are doing equity work. This is the way I tell people to tackle it. Think about what you care about most. Sometimes people say, I care about what goes on in the system of education. Start with what you care about most and go there. So some of you on this call will say, I'm going to work in the system of education. Some of you might say, I'm going to work in the system of policing. So I always say, start with the system that you care about most. And from there, it's working with those organizations to figure out what you can do to help them to advance racial equity. Sometimes it means you just need to use your voice. So in the chat room, you see some suggestions about ways that that you can get involved in different kinds of systems. I always say start with the system first. The other thing too is you're going to, throughout this whole process, you're going to keep working on yourself. That's the one constant. You will always learn and grow and challenge your biases. It's just this continuous work that we have to do. That's going to keep happening. So one of the things that you can be doing is figuring out books and blogs and websites and where's your learning going to come from. Sessions like this, you might decide you're actually going to host a session like this with your neighbors or your friends where you're going to talk about race. I want to tell you a quick story just to tell you how accessible this work really is. My husband is a pastor here in Denver, and we woke up one morning and we said, it would be really nice if we could just pull a few people together just to talk about race, because it's hard to talk about. And he said, well, why don't we? Why don't we just send out an invitation and maybe, 15, 20 people will show up and we'll just have this really informal conversation about race together. So that's what we did. We had this event. Do you know 1,200 people showed up? We were thinking 20. It was 1,200. 1,200 people showed up just to talk about race. And it was the birth of a group that we now call Race Talk University. It's an 8-week course, once a week for 8 weeks, where we learn about how to actually talk about race so you can then go out in your own communities and talk about race. So we're getting ready to have our 4th cohort of that. Well, I guess I'm sharing that with you because I think each of us could do that. You might want to talk about race. You might want to talk about bias. You pick a topic. I think the convening of our friends and our neighbors and our family is the best way to get this work going. But I do think a lot of it starts with us needing to understand our history. And I don't know that we do, because I don't know that everybody got a complete story about the history of racism in this country. We all got pieces. Aaliyah, Race Talk University. We are probably going to be putting something out early next week. There's a Race Talk University website, I think my husband created, because we think we're going to launch a cohort for February. If nothing comes up next week, you can always reach me at the Equity Project, and I'll keep you posted about when we think we're going to have it. Our last cohort happened, and we had 100 people in the cohort. We're probably going to be a smaller cohort this time, but it's really a cool way in a space filled with grace to talk about hard things, which I think the world needs more of. I like, Michelle, Living Room Conversations, the website that outlines some of those conversations. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Help me again. What would it take? What do you need? What do you think you would need more of to advance racial equity in the city of Golden? What do you need in terms of support? Any other thinking there? Tyler? Hi, Tyler.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to jump in, for you. I guess there's some people on here who probably know I've been on a lot of these calls. I'm one of 4 co-chairs of the Golden Anti-Racism Collective here in town. And I just, when you ask that question, think really the biggest thing is just communication. The city's listened on a number of issues, a number of things, but we really need to get on the same page, because we have a lot of people that aren't within the city but are willing to do work and do and help, but without having that a real strong communication line, I feel like that's where we kind of fall off on that. So that should just be something for me in our group, of that communication. I know our link has been shared here many times, and we hope that others come and check us out as well. We've got a lot of good things going on here, but that's one thing I wanted to touch base was our communication.
Thank you. That's so important that, it's one of the complications of racial equity work is everybody goes out and starts doing their own thing, that we lose our connection with one another. And so I always say racial equity work has one requirement that's a non-negotiable, and it is communication. If you're going to work in a collective, which is what this calls for, then communication, or whatever that strategy is going to be for communication, needs to have some fidelity. We got to hold true to it. And when we don't communicate, we should slap ourselves on the hand and say, that was a failure point for us. So it's really important to do that, because we'll go sideways quickly.
And I do want to say, we've had real good communication with Golden Police Department, and I wanted to put that out there for Golden as a whole, that Chief Bill Kilpatrick and others have been very responsive and listening. And we've had those community conversations hosted by city manager, but like I said, I think within really a direct line of communication of events, things that are going on, so we can collaborate and really make a strong push. So
yeah, thank you for that, Tyler. I appreciate you. Thanks for all of your work too there. Joyce, I see your message. I just learned through some anti-racism reading that there was a lot of controversy from Blacks and whites about school integration. Absolutely. Integration was hard. Schools, neighborhoods. My family integrated a neighborhood in Georgia. And I remember the countless nights where my dad sat on the front steps of our brand new suburban house to try to keep white people from spraying the N-word on our garage door one more time, or throwing things at our windows. Integration was hard, particularly in some of the southern cities. And then, of course, integration in schools was really hard. The Little Rock 9 story, and how those 9 young people just wanted to go to school, and we had to have the National Guard involved with them integrating that white school. Carlotta Lanier, one of the Little Rock 9, lives right in Denver, and I've been so lucky to hear her tell the story of what that felt like, to just want to go to school and to have that level of hate in your face every single day. This has caused harm. so much of what we're talking about now has caused harm. We've got a generation or two in our very communities that were upfront and personal during those times and are harmed today. They are living examples of all of the things that we have been talking about. And if they can't be the symbol of us doing this work, then what are we building for the future for our young people? So I'm so thankful to have you have those conversations. I see that some of you are putting some conversations about your own lived experiences in the chat room. That's so important as colleagues and neighbors and friends and community members that you look at some of those. Not everybody unmutes and speaks, but there's powerful, powerful sharing that's going on there. There's also resources that are happening in the chat room too. People that are offering up connections on things that may be important to you, like housing or education. Some of those things are being shared there too. Megan shares, how do you not just replicate white flight reactions with diversity efforts? You know, everywhere I've been, there's been white flight. It is because we've normalized whiteness. I mean, here's Nita's opinion. I think for everything that happens, all of the things we can name, we have to absolutely name the elephant in the room in that issue. So when we say white flight, we all do. Let's talk about why white flight. And that's always my question. Why is white flight happening? Why? Because when you normalize whiteness, when people of color interrupt that whiteness, somehow it feels degraded. So you got to go and start the normalization of whiteness all over again. There are all kinds of ways to think about this, but we have to name the elephant in the room every time it happens. It's really, really painful. Anything else about what you need? What do you need from the City of Golden for you to personally advance this work? Anything else that you want to share there? Okay. So one more thing, and we probably will get done a little sooner. One more thing, I just want to open this up to all of you. I want to open this up for you to share anything that you would want to share in this moment. We're centered on racial equity in this conversation. You've shared so much richness in your comments and your thoughts and your experiences. I have been the probe in the questions, and I want to give you an opportunity before we part ways to share anything that might not fit one of the prompts that I gave that you would want to share as insight for the mayor and city council to inform how we actually advance racial equity in the city of Golden. So is there anything anyone would want to share before we part ways? Pagana, go right ahead.
So this is not for the city council, but I know that some people have been asking about what we can do ourselves to create a more equitable environment for our neighbors.
Yes.
And I will say that along the lines of checking your biases and your prejudices, there are things that are very easy to do, such as when you have a block party, make sure that you don't immediately turn away from your neighbors because they look different than you, or because they have an accent. Make the effort to connect with those neighbors. That is, I don't mean to say that this is generalized or the experience for anybody else, but it is my personal experience that sometimes happens. It's more difficult to get accepted sometimes into the inner circle, in a sense. So just check that. It's as easy as to make the conscious effort to include the people who are not normally in these conversations or at the table, and make sure that you're listening to them.
Thank you so much for that sage advice. It helps us to challenge our biases. Thank you so much. I agree with you, Jason. Thank you for your vulnerability on that.
Okay, couple more thoughts. Meredith and I have been here 40 some years. I'm 75 years old, which means I got my COVID shot yesterday. But outside of that, yeah. But we've done a lot of volunteering. We've done stuff with Habitat for Humanity, and you can do that. And it takes a lot of effort, but it results in a home for people. And truth be told, a lot of times there's people of color, sometimes from Central America, other times not. But there are all these small opportunities. You can change big governments, or you can go out and do small things that help a lot of people.
That's nice. It's so important. I mean, even in the hardest times, Dr. Martin Luther King talked about this. Even in this darkness, we have to consider what we can do to create the light. And
my favorite quote is Eleanor Roosevelt. Better to light a candle than curse the darkness.
There you go. There you go. Well, thank you so much for lighting candles, which is a part of what racial equity work does. It lights candles all over the place. Thank you for your part in that. Anything else anyone's willing to share? Wonderful things in the chat room, but is there anything else outside of some of the prompts that I've given you that you want to share as insight?
Yes, hi, I'm Brian Conroy. I'm the principal at the high school.
Hi, Brian.
And thank you very much for coming in for the City of Golden, for hosting this is very important conversation. I think one of the things that as culturally as Americans, we're bystanders. And so we do a lot of observing, we don't do a lot of action. And I think one of the things that we need to do is give ourselves permission to get involved. And it's I'm not really sure if I should get involved. What should I do? Well, if you don't give yourself permission to get involved, you never will. So I think, when I'm talking with my students, it's around, you have to stand up for what you believe in, and you have to be willing to take that step, that verb action that you were talking about earlier in the conversation. But if we don't give ourselves permission to be involved, stand on the sidelines, we will let other people do it.
Yeah, Brian, thank you so much for that. You've just raised the importance of moving from being a bystander to an upstander. And upstanders are action oriented. You're right on, spot on in what you're saying. Thank you for that. JJ, you want to speak?
Hi, thank you. Well, I was debating whether it was appropriate for myself to speak, but I appreciated that last comment about let's move from just listening to acting. So, folks, I'm JJ Trappy. I'm a city councilor with Golden, and I just wanted to say how useful this has been tonight. And Dr. Nita Tyler Mosby, I just thank you. This has been great. To the 150 folks here tonight and to the city staff who did this, I appreciate you all. I wanted to just quickly say, we committed to listening, learning, and taking actions. And so, you talked tonight about conversation today is going to help us move forward with action tomorrow. And so we're certainly going to do some more action plans and strategic planning. And I saw some comments from folks wanting to know what City Council was doing, but I didn't think this was the appropriate venue for us to talk about it. So I just wanted I'll put it in the chat, but please feel free to email or call. And I'm happy to have all of those conversations with you in a different venue. And thank you for letting me say something.
Oh, great. No, thank you. I appreciate you so much. Wonderful. And look at all the great comments that are in the chat room. I really appreciate that. Let me end with this. And then you probably get 15 or 20 minutes back of your life. This is a reminder. It is a quote that I use quite often. It's my words, but I want to give them to you from my heart. I want you to know in this work, this really complex work we call racial equity work, it is so important for you to know and believe that the goal in all of this is not for you to be perfect. It's for you to be excellent. And I wish that for you. Perfection doesn't necessarily allow you the opportunity to learn and grow and make mistakes and get back up and try again. Excellence does. So anytime you feel you're back up against the wall about being perfect in something, I want you to remember what I'm saying to you right now. We don't have room in racial equity work for perfection. There's nothing smooth about it. It's bumpy. It's hit or miss. It will create opportunities for us to take risks and to innovate. Perfection doesn't allow us that necessarily. So the goal in all of it is not perfection, it's excellence. And I want to encourage you to keep being excellent. Think about yourself first. What do you need to advance racial equity work? What are the tools? What's the learning? What are the opportunities? And then I want you to stretch as far as you can into being an upstander, an active ally or accomplice, determining what you want to do in the systems that mean the most to you. Do that. And then lastly, as you look at your whole community, the city of Golden, how are you working in a collective with others to advance even bigger work? So I thank you. I thank you for all of that. And I thank you for your vulnerability tonight. Thank you for sharing your hearts and your experiences and your great ideas. The mayor and city council are very fortunate to have a community just like you. I'm glad I was able to be a small part of it tonight. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking and then I'll kick it back to, I don't know who, Carly? I don't know who I'm kicking it back to for the official good night.
We want to thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Nita.
You are so welcome. It was a pleasure. I hope you have a great night, everybody. Stay safe.
Thank you. Nita, thank you very much. We really appreciate everything you've done for us tonight.
You're so welcome. It was an honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.